The unlimited power of the sword is not in either the federal or the state governments, but where I trust in God, it will ever remain in the hands of the people. That's from Tench Coxe, a founding father who's almost totally forgotten and ignored today. But at the time of the founding, he was famous. He wasn't just one of the leading advocates for the natural right of self-defense, the right to keep and bear arms. His writings had way more influence on the debates over the Constitution, over ratification, than the Federalist Papers that we hear so much more about today. So on this episode, I'm going to reveal 4 of his top arguments in favor of ratification, including a clear line in the sand between delegated and reserved power, the natural right of self-defense, the militia, the people themselves, the true source of power, and much more. But first of all, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, November 18th, 2024. And first of all, we got to kick it off with an essential question. Why is it important to even read, learn, and understand what Tench Coxe had to write about in 1787 and 1788? And Meharry puts it like this in a new article we ran this morning. For most people, discussions about the meaning of the Constitution begin and end with the Federalist Papers. For people who want to understand what all these various clauses mean, they look to the Federalists, and that's the end of the story. These essays, Mike says, enjoy immense popularity today, and primarily because the authors were famous. This is Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. But in their day, he points out, these essays didn't have widespread influence on ratification itself. It's important to remember that the Federalist essays were written specifically for a New York audience. They were influential in New York State because they were concerned that ratification was going to fail there. So they even addressed every single one of these to the people of the state of New York. And more significantly, Mike writes, they weren't even circulated to any great extent outside of that state during the ratification period. So if we want to understand the original legal meaning of the Constitution as the people who gave it legal force understood it, that is the ratifiers, the Federalist Papers really didn't have much impact at all because they weren't reading them outside of New York State until the following years. And Mike says, on the other hand, Tench Coxe's numerous essays did have a great deal of influence. He addressed many of his essays to the people of the United States, indicating that they were intended for a much broader audience. And while the Federalist essays got virtually no play outside of New York, much of Tench Coxe's work was widely distributed and published in other newspapers in virtually every state where ratification was contested. Now, his Essays of an American Citizen were actually the first published major defenses of the Constitution that were run in any newspapers in the United States. And in his doctoral dissertation on Coxe, Matthew Peterson called him, quote, a one-man propaganda machine. Now, that could be a good or a bad thing, I guess. And possibly, he said, the most widely read of any Federalist author. So of the people supporting the Constitution, Tench Coxe was right up there in the top 1 or 2 of the most widely read, most influential people. And by Matthew's count, there were over 150 total printings and reprintings of his various individual and influential essays. Now, as the founders repeatedly told us, and now here's the big important why thing, the way you understand the legal meaning of the Constitution is really the same as you would understand the legal meaning of any old document. That is, you have to understand what the people who gave it legal force understood it to mean. That means you have to know how the people in the ratification debates understood the legal meaning of the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson explained it like this, for example. On every question of construction, carry ourselves back to the time when the Constitution was adopted. Recollect the spirit manifested in the debates, and instead of trying what meaning may be squeezed out of the text or invented against it, conform to the probable one in which it was passed. And James Madison, father of the Constitution, so-called, had a very similar take. He said, I entirely concur in the propriety of resorting to the sense in which the Constitution was accepted and ratified by the nation. In that sense alone, It is the legitimate Constitution. In that sense alone, that's the only way that you can understand the original legal meaning of the Constitution, according to James Madison. He said, and if that be not the guide in expounding it, there can be no security for a consistent and stable, more than for a faithful exercise of its powers. Now, given that the arguments advanced by supporters of ratification reveal to us how the people who ratified it understood its original legal meaning, Tench Coxe's writings provide an undeniable insight into just how far things have gone off the rails. And I think that's the real great lesson that we get from Tench Coxe, because he's so clear about the structure of the Constitution. And there were few writers, if any, who were more influential than him in his various series of essays of an American citizen, of a Pennsylvanian, and the like, of a freeman. And with that in mind, here are his top 4 arguments. This is kind of a countdown, but let's get right to it. Number 4 is a line in the sand between delegated and reserved powers. This is the 10th Amendment argument before there was a 10th Amendment. And Harry puts it like this: perhaps better than any other supporter of the Constitution, Coxe explained federalism, the division of powers between state and federal governments, writing, the federal government, the general government, is a federal or a union of sovereignties for special purposes. And I'll get to that a little bit more in a moment. But he says Coxe laid out a careful delineation between the specific enumerated powers delegated to the federal government and the massive powers remaining with the states. He hammered this theme in several of his essays, including detailed lists of powers that would specifically remain with state governments and those off limits to the general government. Here's Mike again. He points out that this included 9 broad areas in which the federal government is not authorized to act. So the people were debating over the various powers under the proposed Constitution, and Coxe was very influential and said, here's all these various areas where if you support this, there's no way the federal government can have their hands in these areas. I'm just going to highlight a few of these 9. For example, fix the qualification for electors of the president and vice president, interfere in state courts or determine the criminal offenses of the state, enact laws for the inspection of the produce of the country. So inspection laws for the production of the country, interfere with, alter, or amend the Constitution of any state. And Coxe, Mike points out, also included a 10th category, an entire category covering a vast number of policy areas that are reserved to the states and off limits to the federal government. And of course, in each state, it's up to the people of each state to determine if they want government involved in any of these areas at all, or if they just want to leave it to the market, to the people themselves. They cannot interfere, writes Coxe, with the opening of rivers and canals, the making of or regulation of roads, except post roads, building bridges, ferries, establishment of state seminaries of learning, libraries, literary, religious, trading, or manufacturing societies, etc., etc. But there's a long list. Of course, you can read it in full. This will be linked to in the show notes, but he summed it up with this: nor can they do any other matter or thing appertaining to the internal affairs of any state, whether legislative, executive, judicial, civil, or ecclesiastical. So they can't get involved in almost anything. As James Madison described it more famously in Federalist number 45, is that the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government would be few and defined. Those reserved to the states and the people would be numerous and indefinite. And he went through very specific examples here, Tench Coxe did, to explain that delegated and reserved powers, that line in the sand between the two. Number 3 is a union of sovereign states. Instead of the Constitution creating a singular nation state, kind of what we have today, really. Well, it's not supposed to be like that. The Constitution actually formed a union of sovereign states. And this is how Tench Coxe put it: the matter will be better understood by proceeding to those points which show that as under the old, so under the new federal Constitution. So he's saying, just like we had under the Articles of Confederation when it comes to sovereignty of the states, final authority of the states, and the states representing the people of the several states, whether through their government or other actions, It's exactly the same between the Articles of Confederation as under the Constitution for the United States. He said the 13 United States were not intended to be and really are not consolidated in such manner as to absorb or destroy the sovereignties of the several states. And Tench Coxe explained the differences between the federal and state governments, arguing that they are entirely different entities with different purposes and powers. That's how Mike Meharry described it. Different types of entities with different purposes and different powers. And he said, this is how Tench Coxe put it: the federal government and the state governments are neither coordinate, co-equal, nor even similar. They are of different natures. They're totally different beasts. And to think that they are the same or similar or connected in various ways that people describe them today is way off base. And he went on to contrast these two types of governments, writes Mike. Tench put it like this: the general government is federal, or a union of sovereignties for special purposes, or what Jefferson and Madison would say, general purposes. So very special things that we've said we think are best dealt with by you guys. The state governments, he said, are social, or an association of individuals for all the purposes of society and government. And so he's saying, like, look, these things, these structured governments are so different. They are not the same type of thing. And Meharry points out that Coxe went on to assert that not only do the state governments maintain their sovereignty and independence in the constitutional system, but they are indispensable in its operation. He points out that without the state governments, that of the Union can have no power, because the latter is created by them. The states created the federal government, not the other way around, is the old saying. And Tench continued with, but the state governments have and ever must have much separate and independent power, and do not derive from the federal government any part of what they possess. So whatever independence and sovereignty and authority and power that are in the states has nothing to do with the federal government giving them permission to. And that's kind of an attitude, I think, shift that really needs to happen so much more. Like, okay, you guys are involved in these delegated enumerated powers, Washington, D.C., but everything else, like, it's not even up to you. You have no say over it, and we're going to do what we want to do, whether you like that or not. Now, one of the most important ways that this was to play out under the original Constitution was through the selection of senators to Congress. Back then, before the 17th Amendment, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this already, but in case you're not, back then, state legislatures selected the senators that would represent the states in Congress. They picked their two and they would send them off. After the 17th Amendment, that was changed, and it's now done by a popular vote. But according to Tench Coxe, this was an important way that the federal government relied on the states and acted as a creature of the states. He said they will also feel a considerable check from the constitutional powers of the state legislatures, whose rights they will not be disposed to infringe, since they are the bodies to which they owe their existence, and are moreover to remain the immediate guardians of the people. So, of course, that's missing these days, but according to Tench Coxe, this was a big part of the structure of the original Constitution. Now, while I'm here, I do want to point out that all of these articles and original source documents that I'm mentioning in this episode, these are all going to be published in a blog post for this episode, like we do for every single episode, a couple of hours after the live stream is done over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. It's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. We're all very grateful for Alan Mosley of It's Too Late for doing a great job of getting those blog posts organized, and I will get that published here in a couple hours after the live stream is done. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. I should also mention today that I can announce this guy here. Oh, I should pull it up on full screen. It's the release of our newest book called on here it says not for resale. This is a pre-press copy, but our newest book, The Other Federalist Papers, Tench Coxe. It's 170-ish pages. Mike Meharry wrote a vast majority of the first section on this, which is 50 to 60 pages of analysis of the various arguments that Tench Coxe made in support of the Constitution. And then I think for the first time ever in a handy-dandy print, I don't think I've ever seen it available publicly, is a collection of all the major essays from Tench Coxe, the full text of all of them. We had to do a lot of transcribing here. It's about 110 some odd pages of Tench Coxe's essays. We're talking about from an American citizen, a freeman, a Pennsylvanian, philanthropist, a bunch of other individual ones that most people don't even discuss or even know existed. So that'll all be together in one collection over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/Tench Books. That's TENCH book, BOOK. I thought it was better to use his first name rather than his last name in the URL, just because you know how the internet goes. But it's up for pre-order today, and we're going to be shipping it out. You can also get a Kindle version. We've submitted it to Apple Books and Barnes & Noble for Nook, so that'll be available on all the e-readers in the near future as well. So that book I'm really excited about. We're also working on one on the Anti-Federalist Papers, a series covering George Mason and a number of the other leading anti-Federalist writers like Cato, possibly Brutus. I forget who's going to be included that one, but that'll be out in the next couple of months as well. And we also have one that we're close to wrapping up on the founding practice of war powers under the Constitution from Presidents Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison. And I think that's really powerful stuff. But for today, we're talking about the forgotten other Federalist Papers from Tench Coxe. And when you learn and understand how things were supposed to be, you can see we can see all around us how far things are off the rails, but now we can also explain it pretty well as well. So I appreciate you listening to me ramble about that for just a moment, but let's get right back to it. We've gotten our first two on this list, number 4 and number 3. First of all, a line in the sand between delegated and reserved powers. Number 343 is a union of sovereign states rather than a singular national blob. Number 2 is that all power comes from the people. That old phrase, power to the people, that gets it wrong. It's almost actually completely backwards. And for our number 2, Tench Coxe reaffirmed this long-held principle from the American Revolution that power comes from the people. And here's how he put it. The people will remain under the proposed Constitution, the fountain of power and public honor. That means it's not like they were creating something new. He was reaffirming that this principle that they fought a long, bloody war in support of, that they reaffirmed under the Articles of Confederation, was going to remain the same, that the people are the source of all power. And he put it like this: all the powers of the federal government flow through a very short channel from the sacred fountain of the people. All the powers. That means they're not the boss. The people are. It's just up to the people themselves to learn how to, be the boss, how to protect and defend their own constitution, their own liberty, whether the government happens to like it or not. And Mike Meharry mentions that as well in his article from this morning. He said, like many other Federalist writers that followed, Tench Coxe implied that it was up to the people as the source of all power to ensure that the power they delegated to government was kept within its proper limits. And that leads us to the most, it's all in a random order here, but maybe it's the most important because that being the case, Mike writes, the people require all the tools necessary to assert their power and authority as needed. Like you can say, oh yeah, we're the source of all power, but if you can't do anything about it, if you don't have the means of defending yourself from attacks, invasions on your liberty and authority, there's nothing you can do. And Mike says for Tench Coxe, this was rooted in the natural right of self-defense, and that's number 1 on this list for me today at least. The people retain the ultimate power of the sword, the natural right of self-defense. And here's how Tench Coxe put it. Their swords and every other terrible implement of the soldier are the birthright of an American. a natural right of self-defense, not a Second Amendment right. You don't have a permission slip from government unless you allow government to issue permission slips or you beg government to issue permission slips. As long as people learn how to exercise their rights as a natural right from the nature of your birth, then things will be far different. And Mike points out that Tench Coxe insisted that the power of the sword, the ultimate power of the sword, was truly in the hands of, quote, the yeomanry of America from 16 to 60. So from young to old. And by this, Mike points out, he meant the militia. And he believed that this was the essential first line of defense for the United States. But who makes up the militia? For Tench Coxe, as he said it, it's the people themselves, the yeomanry of America from 16 to 60. And on top of that, if you think about what he's had to say as well, Congress have no power to disarm the militia. Now, a lot of people today want you to believe that that's just some organization under the control of government itself, when ultimately, if the unorganized militia is all of the people, or the people from 16 to 60 at the time, that means they have no power to disarm anyone. And that's an important point here, because the people, if they allow their creation to tell the creators, the people themselves, the people of the several states, that they cannot have the force needed to defend themselves against a creation that violates their liberty on a day-to-day basis, that is absolutely absurd. Tench Coxe put it like this once again, the unlimited power of the sword. Again, unlimited. There's no limits on this. To this forgotten founder, and maybe that's part of why he is forgotten so much today. The unlimited power of the sword is not in the hands of either the federal or state governments, but where I trust in God, it will ever remain in the hands of the people. That one cannot be reiterated enough. And ultimately, this is the type of information that the government-run schools, I never learned it, and I never learned about this guy even once. And of course, all of these principles he hammered home so clearly. And I think that's a big reason why people are just not taught about it. And that's why we work so hard every single day to reach and teach more and more people about these essential foundational principles from the founders and the old revolutionaries. And of course, how to defend the Constitution and liberty when government refuses to do so, which is 24/7, 365. And there is absolutely nothing that helps us do this work more every single day, more than the financial faith and support of our members. Our membership program starts out at just $2 a month. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options available. Again, that's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I'd be extremely grateful to any consideration you can give to joining us today. You can also hit the like button, leave a reviews on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, comments on the archive, subscribing, getting notification, all those free and easy peasy things. Certainly do tell those algorithms to show us to more people. I'm very grateful for your support. And of course, don't forget 10thamendmentcenter.com/tenchbook. TENCHBOOK to get a copy of the other Federalist Papers, Tench Coxe, or maybe 100 copies, whatever it may be. I'm very grateful for any consideration on that. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it made you think. I hope you learned something that's more important than anything. And I hope to see you next time here on the path to liberty.